So I want to talk a little bit about um, an infamous mid-air collision that occurred now almost 17 years ago, and particularly the follow-up events that came about from that. Just a little disclaimer, if I make any mistakes in this video, it's because I'm reading directly from the Wikipedia page, so bear with me. So the 1st of July 2002, there was a mid-air collision over the small German town of Uberlingen, near the Swiss border, and this involved a Bashkirian Airlines flight 2937, which is a Russian Tupolev Tu-154 passenger jet, and a DHL flight 611, which was a Boeing 757 cargo jet. 71 people died in this disaster, and it's to this day the deadliest civil aviation disaster in German history. Um, so that was all 69 passengers and crew on the Tupolev and the two crew members of the Boeing 757. So this case has been documented in the program Seconds from Disaster. I've just watched the episode. It's about the second or third time I've watched that episode. Um, the reason this case stands out, well, there is several fold. Firstly, mid-air collisions are very rare. Aviation accidents happen every year, but mid-air collisions remain extremely rare, particularly in the 21st century. So this was a very unusual occurrence. Um, and secondly, because the air traffic controller on duty on the night ended up being murdered by the relatives or by a relative of some of the victims. Um, so just to give you a little bit of background and what I make of all of this, because it's a very tragic thing. I mean, any aviation disaster is tragic, but I think the circumstances of this one were particularly harrowing. The cause of the accident seems to be a combination of human error and system failure. There was a system in place called, I believe, TCAS, and this was supposed to alert pilots of an impending collision. At the time, the world had this system in place, or world aviation had this system in place, but in the in the Russian protocol, the pilots could make a choice between following the TCAS warning system or listening to air traffic control. So there was a young man on air traffic control duty, and this was a major aspect that came into the investigation. The fact that his colleague had went on an extended break, so he was there on his own, um, and he was under a lot of pressure. Although the nighttime air traffic was significantly less in volume than the daytime traffic, he was basically controlling the entire Zurich airspace by himself. So I think that's a factor. If you look at this from all the angles, I think that definitely plays a role. So basically, he warned both airlines, but he found that he was having a communication problem with another air traffic control station or the airport that the Russian jet was traveling to. I may have got that wrong, but if you watch the documentary, I really recommend it. So as he was trying to sort out this problem, the phone system was down. That was distracting him from the screen, and he actually thought that the disaster had been avoided. He warned both airlines. Investigators found that there was no communication problem. The Russian pilots fully understood English, and what appears to have happened is a combination of human error because this young guy, Peter Nielsen, had told both planes to descend. He also told one plane that I believe it was the Russian craft that the other plane was coming from the right, and it wasn't. It was coming from the left. So I think Peter Nielsen did make mistakes, but I also think that there was a lot of things that happened that night that were beyond his control. I think there was system failure. And there was also protocols in place that have now been revised. For example, they have now made it compulsory for two air traffic controllers to be on duty even during the night shifts. Anyway, there's a very sad backstory to this, or I don't want to say footnote because that somehow trivializes it, but one of the victims' relatives, their father, the father of two young children, who was killed in the crash, a man by the name of Vitaly Kaloyev, who was a Russian architect from North Ossetia. He became fixated on wanting to blame someone for what happened to his children, and he actually tracked down Peter Nielsen outside his own home, even though Nielsen had taken some precautions, and he was no longer working in air traffic control. Um, I mean, this man had lost his wife and two children, so clearly he suffered a lot. But he became fixated with wanting to blame someone. And his version of events is that no one in in the company Sky Track, I believe they were called, showed any remorse or responsibility. Sky Guide, excuse me. They did actually later apologize. So the CEO of the company did later apologize. Um, in interviews he's done, he claimed that Peter Nielsen never showed any remorse, never showed any sort of sympathy for an accident that he had at least partly caused. Now, I find that very hard to believe. I find it very hard to believe that he would have been totally robotic about this when he was so deeply involved in it. Anyway, what happened was Kalayev actually tracked him down outside his own house, stabbed him to death in front of his family. Um, he was put on trial. This was in February, 24th of February 2004, so about a year and a half after the accident. So he'd clearly been brooding on this for a year and a half. He wanted someone to blame, and he blamed Peter Nielsen. He was sentenced to 8 years in a Swiss prison, which in itself is pretty light considering it was premeditated murder. But then that was commuted to, he'd been given psychiatric evaluation. It was commuted to just 2 years because it was deemed that his mental condition was not sufficiently considered in the initial sentence. Um, what I find disturbing is that when he went back to North Ossetia in 2008, he was given a hero's greeting. Apparently, locals said he's a real man because he avenged his family. You know, they seem to respond to this as if he killed a terrorist. And he was even given a medal for the glory of Ossetia. So I find that aspect of it, and most people commenting say this as well. I find that aspect very unsettling. The fact that this man actually hunted someone down and killed them in cold blood because of a tragic accident, and then he was treated like a hero for doing it. I mean, Peter Nielsen did not go into the control tower that night thinking, I'm going to kill 71 people. It was just a horrible disaster. And to this day, Kaliev shows absolutely no remorse for the fact that he killed a man in front of his family in cold blood. Um, People could say he suffered and it was psychological response, but so did other families. What about the 70 other families? So I really think Kaliev is a pretty callous figure. It must be hell to lose your family in the way that he did. He suffered. But what did he do? He caused another family complete heartache and suffering over some sort of notion of, well, in the documentary, he says it wasn't revenge, it was punishment. So his whole attitude to it was that Peter Nielsen had committed some sort of crime, and he didn't look at it as this was a tragic situation, a tragic accident. So I think that it's pretty abhorrent, really, that they're treating this murderer like some sort of hero because he suffered. Um, what's he done? He's created a widow with two more children without a father. So it's just like a vicious cycle. I mean, is Peter Nielsen's children going to grow up then hunt down Vitaly Kaliev? That sort of primitive mindset. That's where it never ends. So Kaliev strikes me as a pretty callous and bitter man. And yes, he suffered, but I find it repugnant that people treat him like a hero. He's a murderer, and he's using his personal suffering to cover the fact that he is a murderer. I mean, this wasn't a spur of the moment thing. This is premeditated murder, and 2 years is a very lenient sentence, really, for taking a man's life. Only 36 years old. So it's definitely one of the most there's been worse air disasters since, but it's definitely one that stands out for those circumstances around it. And that side story is actually it's been adapted into film, with the story being loosely adapted, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, except the nationalities and the names have been changed. And like I said, it's been featured on Seconds from Disaster. So check out that episode. It's very interesting, but also very harrowing. I mean, Peter Nielsen never deserved to die. He never deserved to be murdered. And it is awful what happened. I mean, unfortunately, lessons were learned too late. Anyway, check it out.